Hey kids, welcome to chapter 23. Now, this chapter is actually, I really should just call this the 1920s because that's what this chapter covers. And we as historians give the 1920s its own specific designation. It's a nice little breaking point from changing after World War I to what happens in the Great Depression. This is a 20-year time period of a lot of economic growth and a lot of cultural change. So this decade deserves its own chapter, which is pretty much what your textbook does from here on out, to be completely honest. Now, if there was a story for the 1920s, it would go like this. The economy is going to boom for several reasons, which we'll discuss. The standard of living for every American improves. Most Americans have a lot more money to spend. Culture is going to grow significantly. It's a big wild party, and then it all comes crashing down. That is our discussion in this chapter. Lot to cover. Let's get going. The 1920s are a period of insane economic growth. The best way to think about this is Americans are working in factories during World War I, but there's no consumer goods to buy. The total war made it so that way there was no consumer production. So what happens is that Americans are making a lot of money that they can't spend. Note, we're going to see this theme again later. So once the war is over and factories start producing consumer goods, Americans are going to want those goods. It also helps that a lot of new products are going to be made during this time period. Technology improves greatly because of the war, which is what always happens during war, and that technology is going to be given out to the average consumer. It also helps that 60% of homes are electrified, and they begin using that new technology. What ends up happening though is that we get this new society and culture that's based off of buying stuff. The word for that is consumerism. It means that you get a certain satisfaction from owning products that you wouldn't get otherwise. This comic here on the bottom right is a pretty good description of it. It doesn't matter what you buy. The simple fact that you bought something is going to make you happier. That is how American culture and how our American economy is set up. If people stop buying, our economy comes crashing down. This is a legacy of the 1920s. Will you be happier Christmas morning with a vacuum, ladies? Because that might solve a lot of Mr. Mullen's, life problems. Moving on. The best example of how factories are run during this time period is Henry Ford. Henry Ford is not going to invent the automobile. Instead, he's going to perfect the production of the automobile, and he's going to change how factories are run in this country. Now, I'm going to say a lot of things about Ford, but let's get something out of the way. He's not the best guy. There are a lot of records about him being an anti-Semite, and he's the only American mentioned in Hitler's book Mein Kampf, which is not really a distinction that you want. You don't want to be the only American mentioned in that. That could be a problem. So Ford does have some things about him that we don't like, but his management style for running a factory is actually very, very successful, and it changes how factories are run. So Henry Ford makes the Ford Motor Company, which shouldn't be too much of a shock there, and he is going to use this new process of the 1920s. It's called scientific management. It basically means let's find the most efficient way of making something. Does that sound familiar? That's a very progressive era idea to find efficiency. That's what scientific management is. And through doing this, he figures out that using an assembly line is the best way to make an automobile. And what's interesting about Ford is that normally with an assembly line, you would assume that you want unskilled, cheap labor. But Ford's going to do this a little bit differently. Ford believes that he should pay his employees more because better paid workers work harder. So he raised wages in his factories in order to get the most dedicated workers. He also tries to make sure he sells his cars for as cheaply as possible. That way his workers can afford his product. Get it, Ford? That way they can afford his product. That way they'll buy his product, which will make his product more ubiquitous. It'll keep his factory open. It'll have more and more people buying cars. By the way, a couple years later, most Americans are going to own a Ford car, and Ford's also going to revolutionize the industry by releasing a new car every model year. if you ever hears that phrase, it comes from Ford. He realized that while he made the same car, I think it was for like 5 or 10 years, with the same design, he realized, well, crud, no one's buying them anymore. So he changed the design a little bit, and people all of a sudden wanted to buy this new car. That seems kind of strange. Do they do that today? There's a reason why cell phones are a new model comes out every year that's not drastically different than the one before it. It's the same reason. It sounds like consumerism because that's what it is. How successful is his factory? Well, by 1930, 60% of American homes have a car. Now, this meant a rise in every industry involved with making cars. Steel, rubber, gasoline, all of those things are going to boom during this time period. And it also leads to a huge cultural impact. Americans can now easily leave their house and travel, and are not confined to areas that have a railroad line or a canal line. This is going to change what America looks like. People now move out of the cities and move into the suburbs, which, for my students in Laverne, that's where you are. Um, this also is going to change around the idea of where people shop and buy goods. We're going to have things like strip malls. It's also going to change the idea of space. Now we need to actually open up spaces. That way businesses have parking lots in front of them. Did you know in America in 2014 that there are 5 parking spots for every car? 5 parking spots for every car, not including driveways or garages. That's how important the car is to American culture. We'll talk more about the automobile when we hit the 1950s. Either way, what's important to remember here is that Ford is going to revolutionize how factories are run. Factory workers are going to get paid more under Ford, and really, he changes the way that products are made. Now, there is something though. Now we have to figure out a way, how do we convince Americans to buy these products? Well, this is where another new, I don't think this is actually a good thing from this era at all, comes from. This is where advertising, building, and selling are all going to come into place. I'm not sure you guys can read this image here, but it says, for a better life, start cola earlier. How soon is too soon? Not soon enough. The earlier that you can start drinking cola, the healthier and happier and less socially awkward your baby will be. Start giving him Coca-Cola out of the womb. That's probably not a good idea. But see, these advertisements that make fantastic claims like that to get you to buy them, that's why they exist. And the weird thing is, no matter how crazy advertisements are, they work. And they work really well during this time period, and they still work well now. Businesses are also going to consolidate themselves, which I believe we'll see on the next slide. We'll have a chart of how business consolidate. It's not quite the same thing as forming a trust or forming a monopoly, but it kind of is. Basically, what happens is businesses start buying other businesses in related fields. So, for example, a cookie factory would buy out its neighboring cookie factory. The thing is, they're still going to make 2 different kinds of cookie. They're still quote unquote competing with each other, but the money all goes in the same bucket, but it looks like there's competition. This is what we do in America even today. Now, what happens if there's all these products, but you can't afford to buy them? What happens when your money runs out? Well, we establish this idea called credit. The basic premise of credit is that you pay a little bit up front, or maybe even nothing up front, but you get a product. And then over the next couple of months, you pay back whatever that product cost. But to make it worthwhile to the person selling, they're going to charge interest. So we did this example in class, but essentially, let's just pretend you're buying a $100 textbook. You'll make payments on it every month, and at the end of the loan, it turns out you ended up paying $130 or $140 for a $100 textbook. That's essentially how credit works. You get the product up front, you make payments over a certain amount of time, but you end up paying more than what the product was worth in loans. Loans can be a bad thing, kids. Stay away from them. Hey, look at all those business mergers. This is exactly what happens during the 1920s, and it still continues to this day. Essentially, if you go to a grocery store, anything you buy is going to go into one of 11 buckets, and all those companies share those profits. It's not really competition when all of the money goes into the same buckets, but that is how we've set up the American economy. It might be a bad thing. Another big thing that happens during this time period is a decline in labor unions. The labor movement's going to take a hit in the 1920s, mainly because of a couple of reasons. One, the Red Scare. So Americans are afraid of communism, and for whatever reason, people believe that labor unions are a communist activity. Apparently, working together to get a better whole is communism. That's not what Karl Marx wrote in any of his essays, but that is the mentality that Americans have, and we are petrified of communism. Plus, plain and simple, number two, Americans are making more money. If you make more money, you're less likely to complain. You're less likely to even want or need a labor union. Finally, new industries like the automobile industry are going to discourage labor union involvement from the very beginning. They're going to call themselves a closed shop, which means you can't work there if you're in a labor union. Stuff like that is going to be continuing. The president during this era is Warren G. Harding. Well, he's the first of three presidents during this era, is Warren G. Harding. Now, Warren G. Harding starts off the 1920s by saying, you know what? Let's go back to a state of normalcy. We've had a lot of crazy change in the last 20 years with the Progressive Era and World War I. Let's go back to how things were before. Wouldn't that be great? And you know what? America's like, yeah, let's go back to normal. It's been so crazy. Let's go back to how things were in 1890. It was so much better then. You know, we had a lot of immigrant labor that didn't know what they were doing. We had a lot of slums and ghettos. We had a lot of businesses taking over the government and paying us nothing in wages. Those were great times. Let's go back. It's so weird when you look back 30 years ago and be wistful about it. Life wasn't all that great before. Not saying it's always great in the future either, but you don't necessarily want to go into the past. Remember, if you go back in time too far, you don't have air conditioning. Anyway. Harding is president. Well, Harding's kind of a laid-back dude. Really, he's more concerned about hanging out with his buddies than legislating. Of course, that's a gross overgeneralization, and I'm sure there's some President Harding historian that's been watching these videos going, yeah, we're finally talking about Harding. Oh my god, he's saying bad things about him. Well, sorry, buddy, but that's just kind of the way this goes. Harding's kind of a laid-back dude, which means he's not as concerned about what big business is doing, what really anyone is doing in government. He hires a bunch of people to work with him. We call them the Ohio Gang or the Poker Cabinet. These are all presidential advisors that are just his buddies. They just hang out with him. They sit and they, drink and gamble, smoke, and hang out in the White House and pretty much do nothing. This is actually going to lead to a lot of corruption in his cabinet, which takes me to the next slide. The Teapot Dome scandal. So, Teapot Dome is an area in Wyoming that has it's public land, which means the federal government owns it, which means you own it. Essentially, what happened here is that this dude named Albert Fall, his name doesn't matter, and the Attorney General Harry Daugherty, name doesn't matter, are going to basically lease oil reserves on government land to illegally to a company in exchange for bribes. So essentially what happened here is these government officials were bribed into breaking a law for a private business to make money. It makes the government really upset, and it makes the people really upset that this broke down. In fact, some people argue that the reason why Warren G. Harding died of a heart attack in 1924 was because of Shane. Well, it's now 1924, it's almost time for an election, but the president just died, which means his vice president takes over. Let's talk about him. His name is Calvin Coolidge. Some people call him Silent Cal. I happen to be one of those people, mainly because I think it's just an interesting nickname. So it's really weird. Imagine you have to run for re-election as president, but you're already president. So you already have all this power, you already have all this influence, and now you're trying to convince America to vote for you. And they all know who you are because you just became president kind of, as a shock. The whole nation's shocked by the heart attack of Warren G. Harding, and then all of a sudden they hear about this guy named Calvin Coolidge. And then, almost immediately after that, he has to run for election. It's pretty good marketing strategy, I guess. I guess if you want to become president, be vice president, have the president die about 6 months before the next election, run for re-election, and you're probably going to win. Happened to Calvin Coolidge. The good thing is, Calvin Coolidge is also pretty humble. We just had a corrupt presidency, even if Warren G. Harding knew nothing about it. We just had a corrupt presidency, and now we're going to have a really quiet, reserved person as president, and America's looking forward to that. Here's the election map for 1924. You'll see that Coolidge gets a pretty good majority here, mainly because people knew who he was. Now, it could get complicated if we talk about the Progressive Party. The Progressive Party tries to make a jump back into the election cycle, and some Americans are like, yeah, let's go back to the Progressive era reforms. But, again, as I've told you, we have a two-party system, and having a third party just ain't going to cut it. So Calvin Coolidge wins pretty handily, even though Americans don't know that much about him. Let's talk about some legislation during this time period that relates to Coolidge. The first one is the McNary-Hagan bill. This is a bill that is brought up by farmers. The idea was that the government would purchase surplus commodities in order for farmers to be able to make a profit and keep making needed supplies. So what's starting to happen is the price of food fluctuates a lot. The McNary-Hagan bill would have, it's not passed, it would have made it so that way the government pays farmers to just keep farming food. That way, there's always incentive for farmers to make food, because it turns out you need food to survive. So it's not a good idea for farmers if the amount of money they make is dependent on the prices of food. Because what happens if they all just decide to stop? Oh, I can't make money on food, I'm just going to stop making it. That'd be a bad thing for everyone else. So the McNary-Hagan bill was designed for farmers to always be able to make enough money to keep their farm running. Calvin Coolidge is going to veto this, and it actually doesn't happen. Spoiler alert, something bad's going to happen because of this, but, wait till the end of the chapter and the start of the next one. Now, it's also important to note that the United States is not part of the League of Nations, but they're still going to be involved in world affairs, just not in the capacity of the League of Nations. The first way is through the Washington Naval Arms Conference. Now, I'm going to give you guys a hint. Whenever you see the word arms, when it comes to either a treaty or a conference or a discussion, whenever you see the word arms, the answer is always limiting it. Whenever you see a conference that has the word arms in it, or a treaty, or a discussion in Congress about the word arms, it always means to limit. We very rarely say we want to make more weapons. It's almost always, you know what, we made too many, it's time for them to go away. After World War I, we made too many weapons, it's time for them to go away. So, essentially, this is going to be all big major nations from World War I agreeing to stop making weapons. That way, war doesn't get more violent. It doesn't work. Finally, let's talk about the Kellogg-Briand Pact of 1928. This is a pact which stated that the countries who signed this treaty would not start an offensive war. You want to guess what the punishment was if you started an offensive war? Right. It was to have war against you. So the punishment for war is war. I'll let that one sink in for a second. Amazingly, that actually does pass, and there's going to be a violation of the Kellogg-Briand Pact, which actually is a big start for World War II. As silly as it sounds, it's something that we do. Now, here's the big one. This is the one that actually matters. Put a star next to this one. This one comes up a lot. Here's the idea. It's the 1920s, and you guys don't know this, or maybe you should because you all took world history last year. In the 1920s, Europe kind of goes through an economic collapse. They don't do well after World War I, and that's not good for us. Well, why would that be bad for us? Europe is our biggest trade partner. If Europe doesn't have any money because of an economic depression, that means they're not going to buy anything. If they don't buy anything from us, that means our businesses make less money, which means they employ less Americans. As such, it makes logical sense that the United States needs to make sure that there's money in Europe. If money is in Europe, America will be okay because those Europeans will buy stuff from us and keep the economy going. Remember, this is the idea of capitalism. Money has to be flowing between people, between countries, between businesses. Money needs to keep going, or else the whole thing crumbles. The United States needs to trade with Europe. But Europe's got a problem. They're out of money. They've been trying to rebuild themselves, but they're out of money. Here comes the Dawes Plan. The United States is going to give money to Germany in loans. Germany owes a lot of money in war reparations. So what Germany is going to do is they're going to take that money and pay back the Allies' war reparations. What the Allied powers are going to do, the European powers, they're going to pay back the United States from debts, and then they're going to be basically rebuilding their countries with this money. Essentially, what the United States did is it paid itself. You can see it in this triangle here. We essentially paid ourselves, but in the process of doing this, we put some more money into the European economy, and this is going to help restabilize Europe and as such, restabilize our economy. It only kind of works, but the point behind it is to restabilize the economy. Before we start this next section, I want you guys to ask yourselves, what is a culture? How do you define it? Well, a culture is made up of the language we speak, the food we eat, the music we listen to, the sports we watch, the clothes we wear. That is what makes up our culture. What starts to happen in the 1920s is that there's going to be a really big mix of American culture. American culture is going to change, and this is going to have a really positive effect on our culture. For the longest time, our culture has basically been a reflection of Europe. We pretty much do and say whatever Europe does. Whatever's popular in Europe becomes popular here. Whatever's popular, whatever music style is popular in Europe is popular here. In fact, name an American composer from the 1800s. Well, you might not be able to do that anyway, but it's actually kind of hard. There aren't as many. But what starts to happen after World War I is that we're going to start creating our own culture. We realize that Europe's kind of messed up, and maybe we shouldn't try to be like them anymore. Maybe we should try to be like ourselves. It also helps that with new technology and this huge influx of immigrants, both internal and external, this migration that we've had, it's basically going to force a lot of people to live with each other that normally don't, and it's going to force them to interact. And what ends up happening is that it makes a new American culture. Let's tell the story of how this happens. One of the places and one of the best ways to start telling this story is to look in Harlem in New York. By 1930, more than 40% of the nation's 12 million blacks have moved to cities. Remember how I told you guys that one of the consequences of World War I was that many blacks are going to leave the South and go into the North? Well, now here's where that story was leading to. Many blacks are going to move into major cities in the North. The big one being, of course, Harlem in New York. Unfortunately, after the war ends, this becomes a city of high poverty, high unemployment, and severe overcrowding. What starts to happen is artists begin to write songs, to paint pictures, to write poetry about what the black experience is like in the inner city. And it's not a good story. It's a sad story. But what's interesting is that what comes out of this is that there's a certain showing of the pride of being part of black culture. It's not life sucks because I'm black. It's life sucks because I'm an American, and being black is something we should be proud of. So there's going to be a little bit of a difference in what the story being told here actually is. Again, there is a pride in who you are and dealing with whatever struggles life gives you. That's kind of what comes out of the Renaissance, the Harlem Renaissance, I should say. That's kind of what comes out of it. But more importantly, my favorite thing that comes out of the Harlem Renaissance is the music. I'd give a pretty penny of money to go back into the 1920s and be there as music progressed from the ragtime era that we've already talked about and pushes forward into the big band era. This era of music, this 40 years in American music from about 1910 to about 1950 is some of my favorite music to listen to even to this day, and it is some of the most lively, vibrant music that you can find. In fact, every music that you like, whatever music form you like to listen to, whether it be some new boy band or some sort of gangster rap or screamo about dads not hugging you enough, whatever you're into, that music has a callback to this part. What happens in the Harlem Renaissance, what happens in the 1920s, is the birth of American culture, because it's the birth of music. What started with one person at a piano is going to grow into full ensembles. What starts as one person on a piano, maybe singing a blues song about how bad their life is, suddenly grows into larger ensembles, playing music that really goes against the European style of music. European music is big, lush symphony ensembles, playing very specific music, no improvisation. It's very specific, it's very refined, it's very what you guys would consider boring because you're not cultured enough. But what starts to happen in America, especially in all these inner cities, is that they take the instruments that have been used in orchestras and instead play them in different ways. Suddenly, instead of everyone playing the same thing, now different instruments play different things. Instead of playing what's written on a page, now you kind of make up what you want to play. It's very chaotic, it's very sporadic, but it's jazz. And that is the music of this time period. It is America's truest gift to the world. This music form is something that had never existed anywhere else. It's America's gift to the world. And where does it come from? It comes from these inner city areas in the United States. Specifically, it comes from black culture, blacks struggling in those inner city areas, and they express that struggle through art. Some famous musicians of this time period, George Gershwin writes something called Rhapsody in Blue, which is a song we will listen to in class, and it's something that I think you guys will find very telling. It's a big part of our culture is that song. Louis Armstrong is perhaps the most famous jazz musician of this era, and you'll notice that he is a black musician, which is actually going to be kind of controversial, but the music he makes is so exciting and it speaks so much to America that they don't really notice the color of his skin, which is a good thing. Finally, Duke Ellington is also a piano player and composer from this time period. He actually becomes the most popular composer of the time period, and he writes songs about what it was like growing up and being a black American. We'll listen to one of them in class. Jazz becomes popular among the younger generation, especially because it was music that could easily be danced to, which, of course, you young kids seem to love. In fact, jazz and music become so important to American culture that when the entire American economy crumbles in the Great Depression, the only people still making money, the only industry that's still successful is music. It's like, the exact opposite of today. What's really interesting is that Americans are actually going to end up with disposable time. When you live on a farm, even when the sun goes down, you don't have a lot of disposable time. You are basically responsible for the crops and the animals at all times. But when you live in a city, when you're done at the factory, you're done. Heck, because of the progressive era, you might even have weekends off, or at least one day of a weekend off. So you need something to fill that time, and that's another part of American culture. New inventions like the radio and motion pictures are going to really capture America's attention. As much time as you guys spend on the computer, on the internet, and on your phones, or if this is some future time period and I haven't updated this, whatever weird, mystical future technology you use, take the amount of time you guys spend on that, and that is the amount of time that Americans spent listening to the radio or going to the movies. Because it's something that you need to do. But you know what else the radio and movies did? It helps establish a common American identity across the entire continent, and that's going to be important. By 1930, nearly every American household had a radio, and most Americans went to a movie theater at least once a week. Which is strange, because early movie theaters, the movies didn't have any sound. Really, it wasn't until 1927, a movie called The Jazz Singer is the first movie that actually has sound and people talking. The next year, in 1928, this young artist named Walt Disney releases an animated feature called Steamboat Willie. It becomes insanely popular. These movies become so popular that 80 million Americans go to the movies every week. That's significantly higher than they do today. And this place, Los Angeles, California, becomes the motion picture and hence cultural capital of the United States. Movie stars begin to become important in American culture. In fact, many Americans know more movie stars than they know presidents. In fact, I'm sure I could ask you guys, well, not now because you're so far into APUS, but if you go to the average American on the street and ask them to name 15 presidents, they can't do it. Ask them to name 15 movie stars or to tell you the top 10 movies by box office gross, and they can do it. We care much more about celebrities than we do about the politicians around us. Heck, have even more fun and see if anyone in your family knows who the mayor is or who the member of the House of Representatives is for your congressional district. The answer may surprise you. Note, look it up before you ask that question. Speaking of celebrities, let's talk about some that maybe you've even heard of. I'd argue that most of you have heard of Babe Ruth, even if you don't like sports, even if you don't like baseball, even if you don't like black and white photos. You probably know of Babe Ruth, the most successful American baseball player of his era, and the most successful American baseball player for about 60 years until someone took his spot. This is what our culture becomes. In fact, Babe Ruth is one of the first people to make more than the president in this country that's not a business owner. He becomes an athlete that makes more money than the president per year. When he was asked about this, about whether or not it was okay that he made more than President Hoover, Babe Ruth famously replies, "Well, I had a better year than him." I paused for laughter. But he becomes a national hero for playing sports, and suddenly everyone knows about him. However, the biggest overall celebrity of the 1920s is a guy named Charles Lindbergh. He's a daredevil pilot who flew solo across the Atlantic Ocean in 1927. It's weird, that doesn't seem like it's that long ago. It was the first time someone flew across the Atlantic by themselves. He becomes an instant celebrity and a success story, representing the strength, ingenuity, and success of the American people in the 1920s. And his celebrity is going to carry on many years after his death, which is actually still a long time out. I'm not even sure why I said that. Pretend I didn't. Moving on. Unfortunately, not everyone gets involved in the party of this time period. What's weird is that while music and celebrity are kind of just moving forward about how great things are, literature is kind of like, things actually kind of still suck. Authors begin to be concerned about the influence of liberalism in society, and they begin to express themselves about how they're concerned about how society is changing. We call them the Lost Generation. The first dude is F. Scott Fitzgerald, who writes a book called The Great Gatsby. What's interesting is that you're going to read Great Gatsby and be like, wow, he really describes American culture during this time period pretty well. But if you read it again, you might realize, he isn't making this seem all that good. F. Scott Fitzgerald did not like this time period. He wasn't happy with the culture of this time period. He was concerned that the drinking, dancing, and loose morals were destroying American society. His book actually demonizes the opulence of this era, not the other way around. Which is why sometimes when you see movies about this, they kind of got the message wrong. Ernest Hemingway is also going to criticize American culture, specifically our glorification of the military. Ernest Hemingway had a rough time in the military, and he had post-traumatic stress disorder. So he's going to criticize how Americans glorify war. These are part of what we call the Lost Generation, because they kind of disagree with the rest of American culture. A big part of the cultural change of this time period is going to be with women. Now, through things like the cult of domesticity, it's been stated that a woman's role is to stay in home while the men go out and work. However, with modern inventions, women are needed less and less inside the home, and women are left with a lot of free time. Women have gained the right to vote with the 19th Amendment, but they're still going to be held back from equal participation in voting and equal participation in the working world. So they're still going to be held back, even though they've received a slight form of liberation. Women are going to, with all their disposable time, women are going to start going to college more and more. And while they're there, they start learning the stories, or not the stories, I should say. They start learning about things from liberal authors such as Sigmund Freud. Sigmund Freud is interesting because he is a professor who starts openly talking about sexuality and not just sexuality, but the difference between the sexes. What is similar and what is different about them? It's very controversial at this time period, but what it's going to do is it's going to start making people think about the world around them. You may have heard of the Oedipal complex. That comes from Sigmund Freud. What starts to happen, though, is as advertisements are starting to go during this time period, advertisements start to be garnered towards women. Women are seen as the people in the family that actually end up spending more of the money, ostensibly to take care of the family, but since women are the ones shopping, it makes sense to garner advertisements toward them. And now advertisements start to come out that start to basically show a woman's body and physical appearance as being important. And at the same time, culture starts to break away from the Victorian mentality. This is a time period where birth control first comes into effect, which gives women power over their body and power over relationships. In fact, as a result of birth control and as a result of the liberation that women feel in the 1920s, the divorce rate is going to spike during the 1920s. It's starting to freak people out. There's also going to be a group of women who are going to rebel against the conservative nature of the 1920s, and they are going to go out and show off who they are. We call them flapper girls. And it's interesting that we call them flapper girls because what these girls are trying to do is to look like a young boy. If you look at these pictures, you'll notice that the dresses that they're wearing are not very flattering to the female figure. Hair is cut really short and covered up. And legs are going to be covered with stockings. Basically, these girls were trying to look not like the typical depiction of a woman during this time period. It was a way for women to express themselves by doing something unexpected, by looking like boys. And they start acting like the boys had been acting during this time period as well. They start dancing this very sexual dance, which is called the Charleston. And if you ever see it, you'll be like, wait, that's a sexual dance? It's basically just people standing next to each other and kicking their legs out. But that's actually considered a sexual dance during this time period. Nothing like insert whatever random dance style is risque. At the time of recording this, I would say twerking, but who knows what it is by the time you listen to this, the way society changes. While very few women actually become flapper girls, their effect on society is actually very significant. These women begin to liberate the idea of being a woman and liberate women and release women from cultural norms. What's interesting is that because of these women start to be permitted to engage in sporting activities and other events that were previously only for men. It's interesting how it happens, but this is actually a huge, cultural impact that women have. All right, let's talk about this trial. Now, as America is going further and further away from conservative ideals, it's kind of weird. I called in the previous slide, I called this era a conservative era because pretty much every time society changes, there's always going to be a conservative backlash. So as society gets a little bit more liberal, as morals start to get a little bit more unrestricted, the immediate backlash of that, of usually the older generation, is to be like, no, we can't have this change. So while women are starting to express themselves both physically and I guess you could say sexually during this time period, what's going to happen is that there's going to be a cultural backlash because of it. We call it fundamentalism. So here's the basic premise of what happens here. As science and culture advance, a lot of people on the far religious right, as we call them, are going to be very upset by this. Now look, most people who are religious don't have a problem with cultural changes like this. They see it as part of society advancing. But there's always going to be some people, typically older, more religious people, that are going to see this as going against the ideals of their youth. That's kind of how you think about a fundamentalist. A fundamentalist is not every religious person. A fundamentalist is almost like a religious extremist. They're a little bit further into their religion than other people. Think of like the example I would use from the time period I'm recording this would be like the Westboro Baptist Church. We would call them fundamentalists. Fundamentalists tend to believe in the literal truth of the Bible, the literal translation of the Bible, the literal truth. God created the earth in 7 24-hour days. The earth is only 6,000 years old. People that would fall under that belief category are the ones I'm talking about with fundamentalists. And they're going to be the ones that are the most upset by societal changes. What really starts to upset them is the fact that many schools start to teach the ideas of Darwin. Darwin, of course, writes his book, I think it's either 83 or 93. That's the kind of thing I should look up before I start making a video lecture. But anyway, and schools start teaching this theory of evolution, and it really starts to bother fundamentalists who believe that the only truth that matters comes from the Bible. Well, this is going to lead us to a This is going to lead us to a court trial. Let me tell you the setup. Story goes like this. Many states start to ban the teaching of evolution. Specifically, states in the Deep South that are usually very conservative and very heavily religious start to ban schools from teaching, really, science in this case. It doesn't go well. So the leader of this movement to make people stop teaching about biology, I guess you could say, is going to be this dude. You've heard of him. His name is William Jennings Bryan. Yes, he is still part of the story. But fortunately, this is where he exits the story. The setup goes like this. In 1925, the state of Tennessee bans the teaching of evolution in schools. A biology teacher named John Scopes is going to violate this law. John Scopes is going to teach the theory of evolution, and he is immediately going to be fined, and he is going to be, I think he is arrested and fined, and a court case is basically going to come out because of his arrest. We call this case the Scopes trial. On one hand, you have John Scopes, who's going to be represented by this lawyer named Clarence Darrow, and on the other hand, you're going to have a dude named William Jennings Bryan representing religion. This case becomes a case of science versus religion. Who's going to win? This trial becomes a media frenzy, and the small town where this takes place is going to be basically completely overrun with reporters. There's going to be hundreds of reporters listening to this case. Who's going to win? Is science going to win, or is the Bible going to win? Now, long story short, legally, in this case, the Bible is going to win. Why? Because Scopes broke the law. The law did say you can't do this, and he did it. So he did violate the law. So Scopes is going to be found guilty of the crime. But in the context of the argument that's going to be released, what starts to happen is that the religious side can't argue against science. For example, Darrow was going to ask William Jennings Bryan, so, like, you believe the earth was created in 7 days? And William Jennings Bryan goes, well, not 7 literal days. But wait a minute, that's kind of what you just argued, right? Well, the Bible's open for interpretation in that regard. But you just said it wasn't. Well, but it is. It kind of makes the religious side seem a little, different, because they couldn't clearly and logically argue what they were saying, wherein the scientists could. That is the scope of this case. Despite this setback, fundamentalism is going to continue in the United States, and soon the United States is going to split over these two causes, and really religion and science have been at war ever since, which is unfortunate because they really shouldn't be. Religion and science should work together. Once the war in Europe is over, Europeans are going to start trying to come to America. And we're not going to be too happy about the fact that Europeans are trying to come to America. Remember, the United States does not like immigrants. For a nation of immigrants, we truly do hate them. So what starts to happen is that as Europeans try to come here, Americans try to limit the amount of immigrants that can come in. Which, you gotta remember, Europe's going through a horrible economic depression during this time period, on top of the fact that many people were disrupted because of the war. Now they can't eat. They're going to try to leave. But we're going to try to make sure we only let so many in the United States. And by the way, we're trying to become a homogeneous nation. We're trying to become the same. That's not really going to work if you allow in a bunch of immigrants. So, in response to this increase in immigration, Congress is going to pass a couple of laws which is going to restrict immigration from Europe. The first one is called the Quota Act of 1921. This set a 3% limit on individuals from each nation of origin based on the 1910 census. So you guys can see that there is a little filter there, which is at 3%. Basically, we don't want immigration numbers to be extremely high. That's why that number is chosen. Well, that doesn't do a good enough job. So the National Origins Act of 1924 is going to lower it to 2% based on the 1890 census. Specifically, this is going to limit the number of Southern and Eastern European immigrants trying to come into the country because they are seen as the worst. So basically, our goal is to limit immigration. What starts to happen during the 1920s is that total immigration is going to drop basically 75% in this country. So we're really trying to get rid of immigrants during this time period. What's interesting, though, is that this doesn't limit immigration for Latin Americans. I said Europe. From Latin America, we're going to allow immigrants to come here no problem, mainly because Latin American immigrants are going to come to the part of the United States that's the most underserviced. The fewest people are living in the southwestern United States. That is where Latin American immigrants are going to migrate to. By 1930, 2 million Mexican born people had come to the United States, specifically to California. We don't have the numbers for the rest of Latin America. In California, most are going to work in agriculture, while others branched out to all other sectors of manufacturing. That being said, Mexican citizens coming to the United States don't have the easiest time. They're not going to be well liked, but their restrictions not going to be limited. Story goes that up until World War II, a Mexican farm worker could leave Mexico, walk all the way up to Los Angeles, farm outside the city of Los Angeles for a couple of months, and then walk back and not have to worry about border crossing, a fence, anyone saying anything about them doing that. It was actually a very big part of Mexican culture to farm in Mexico for a couple months, then farm in California as the seasons changed, and then switch back. So Mexicans during this time period became very migratory, I should almost say, because they were migrating to where the work was, and they would go back. So when a border fence is finally going to be put up and immigration restrictions are finally put up, Mexican Americans are like, what's going on? This hasn't been a problem for years. Why is it a problem now? Now, when you are studying the case of how America does not like immigrants, this is the court case you should look at. This is going to be the case of Sacco and Vanzetti. Now, why does America not like immigrants? Well, essentially, if you want to take it down to the simplest component, we don't like immigrants because we're concerned immigrants are going to destroy the American national fabric. We're concerned that immigrants are going to take away what it means to be an American and bring in their weird ideals here. Which is why, when you hear the case of Sacco and Vanzetti, two very non-American sounding names, when they're involved or they're suspected of a crime, the American public is going to immediately assume they're guilty. Sacco and Vanzetti were two Italian anarchists who were accused of murdering a paymaster in Massachusetts in 1920. A paymaster is someone you go to at the end of a work shift to get paid. The evidence against them was shoddy at best, and the two men were given a show trial and they were convicted of a crime anyway, with very little actual evidence. The judge was openly hostile to the two men and actively called them anarchist bastards. They were executed by the electric chair in 1927, which is extremely uncommon for the time period and uncommon now. Why were these guys chosen? Because they're immigrants. Were they actually anarchists? Maybe. Were they going to do anything all that bad? Well, they're just two dudes. They're two Italian dudes. I mean, what are they really going to do? Doesn't matter. America doesn't like immigrants. This is the example to go along with that idea of the rise of nativism. Unfortunately, there's going to be another rise in this country. This is going to be the rise of the KKK. They're going to come back. Remember how I told you the KKK has 3 iterations? This is the second one. This is the most powerful iteration of the KKK. This is when they have really their glory days. The KKK is going to demand 100% Americanism, and they start to target people that they don't think of as American. Specifically, they start targeting Jews, Catholics, immigrants, and communists. There's also going to be an outcry against people with loose sexual morals, and of course, the KKK is also going to be anti-black American as well. Lynchings are going to continue, as well as cross burnings and other forms of violence all over the South. Over 5 million people joined the KKK in the 1920s. In fact, many future presidents are members of the KKK during this time period. This is where things get a little dicey. Some people argue that the KKK was not actively a racist hate group during this time period. It was also some sort of a social club, which is how some people defend the fact that they were in the KKK. But let's not split hairs here. The KKK is full of awful, horrible people, and the people that joined it in the 1920s, no matter what reason why they joined, are basically joining a group that's saying, if you're not like us, you don't belong in America, which really is the exact opposite of what America really should be about. The Klan is not just made up of insane rednecks, it is made up of influential politicians and public leaders. In some states, it became an actual political party. It was so popular because the message spread to the people hardest hit by the social change, the conservative middle class. It gave a sense of empowerment to those that did not fit in with the changing culture. The Klan movement dies as quickly as it has grown, though. It's a long story as to why, but basically the Grand Dragon's going to be found for going against everything his party believes. Oh, wait a minute, you're telling me someone that's a crazy radical actually ends up doing the things that he's been trying to preach his people against, that he says is so wrong? Yeah. The KKK is going to dwindle during the 1920s, 30s, 40s, 50s, and 60s, but it doesn't really officially go away. In fact, the third iteration of the KKK is going to happen during the Civil Rights Movement, and it's actually still with us today. The KKK is actually still popular. And the KKK will tell you that the best thing that ever happened to them was Barack Obama becoming president, because it increased membership of the KKK dramatically. It's an unfortunate state for America that this group still exists, and this group is still gaining popularity to this day. It's my hope that within a couple of years, or maybe depending on how long this video is up on YouTube, maybe by the day I retire from teaching, the KKK will officially be gone. But we have no way of knowing. As a response to the growing nativism and the growing KKK, there's going to be a black civil rights leader named Marcus Garvey who is basically going to be the opposite of the KKK. The KKK is saying that only certain people are Americans and that people that aren't American need to be punished. Whereas Marcus Garvey is going to say, hey, you know what? This is what being an American is. And in fact, we should glorify our culture and who we are. Marcus Garvey is going to say we should glorify black culture, not hide from it. We shouldn't be afraid to be black. We should be proud that we are black. He also argued that blacks should use their economic power. He tells blacks that they should only purchase items from black stores, and by doing this, it would help the black community and hurt the white community. So it's kind of funny. I said earlier that he is saying anyone can be an American, but really, he's really going to try to favor black Americans and try to help black Americans help themselves. He actually also sets up something called a Back to Africa movement, which really upsets the NAACP. The NAACP is trying to promote racial harmony, and by telling blacks to leave the country and Africa is the only place for them, it's kind of disrupting the overall civil rights message during this time period. Unfortunately, Garvey is going to be arrested for mishandling of funds and is going to be deported. And his Black Power movement, or Black Rights, I really should say, movement is going to be taken away with him temporarily. This idea of being proud of being black is going to come back a little bit later, though. Hey, let's end this chapter, because the next chapter needs a character, and that character is set up at the end of this one. Herbert Hoover decides, you know what? No, sorry, I said Herbert Hoover. Whew. Calvin Coolidge decides he's not going to run for president again. He's not going to run for re-election, which is pretty good, because the American public is not too happy about this guy. He's not the most charismatic person. It turns out a person with the name Silent Cal is not all that interesting. Who'd have thought? So when 1928 comes around, there's going to be some new candidates. The Republican Party is going to choose a dude named Herbert Hoover, who we'll talk about in a second, and the Democratic Party chooses a guy named Alfred Smith. He's on the left. He's a weird looking dude. I'm glad he didn't become president. Actually, the biggest reason why he doesn't become president is that Alfred E. Smith is a Catholic, and America doesn't like people that are Catholic. I don't know why, we just don't. Especially in our president. We've only ever had one Catholic president. I'm not really sure what the logic behind that is, but it's true. Now, the Republican Party is going to select Herbert Hoover, who believes in something called rugged individualism, which basically implies that anyone could become a success if they tried hard enough. Hoover has never held an elective office before and had spent many years abroad. Hoover's not the most interesting person, and he refused to actually campaign. But oddly enough, that actually ends up helping him. The American public's like, okay, well, there must be something about this guy because he won't say anything to us, so he must be important. It seems kind of strange, seeing as how they didn't like Silent Cal, but that's 1920s for you. Hoover's going to win this election in a landslide. Hoover's presidency starts off with a lot of promise. He supports workers. He wants to promote environmental improvement and conservation. He also is going to push through American infrastructure improvement with this thing called the Hoover Dam. You should know it, Southern Californians. It's where your water comes from. However, there's going to be a big crisis brewing in America, and Hoover is not the person to deal with it. He's not the president to handle this upcoming crisis. It turns out this idea of rugged individualism, of being able to support yourself, isn't going to help when the entire economy crumbles around you. But that's a story for another chapter. Good luck in your studying, guys. I think you guys will do okay. Remember, the 1920s is a period of severe cultural change for the better. But whenever culture changes, there's going to be a backlash to it. So the culture changes by having women have more rights, by having this new artistic movement going through this time period. The cultural backlash is going to be the growth of fundamentalism and the growth of the KKK and the rise of nativism. If you guys can piece all those stories together, you truly understand the 1920s and you'll be ready for a test.